Welcome to episode 3 of the Splitting Headache podcast with me, Nick Coffer, and Joanna Abrahams. Joanna, you're a family lawyer. You're with Velamus Law in London, where you're a director and a partner. And so far, we've covered 2 meaty topics. We did parental alienation in episode 1. If you haven't heard that yet, I'd strongly recommend listening to it. It's a big topic. It's an important topic. What happens if your children don't want to see you post a divorce, post a separation? How do you navigate that really, really difficult process if you feel that you've been alienated from your children? In episode 2, we looked at what we call contact or schedules or arrangements. How do you organise the children if you are divorcing or separating? A really important topic because, Joanna, everything revolves around the children during a separation, doesn't it?
Mostly, yes, but it has to fit in with you as well to some degree.
But they are very important. As we said last time, they didn't choose to have us and they didn't choose it for us to get divorced either. In this episode 3 coming up, we're going to be talking about, I think, a really, really critical subject. And it's the question of parental conflict and parental hostility, because separation and divorce by definition is difficult. By definition, it can be conflictual. But what impact can that have on the children? I'm delighted that we're joined today from our house in the southwest by Trish Barry-Relph. Trish is a systemic family therapist and a consultant clinical social worker. Trish, before we get into the meaty topic, just explain what both of those titles mean. What do you do?
So I offer a specialist separated family therapy program, specifically for high conflict, where both parents have not been able to agree. They may have been in the court system some considerable period of time before they come to me. In some cases, they've been in the court 11 years, 5 years, 4 years. They've spent eye-watering sums of money in legal proceedings, and they are looking for a different way to resolve the conflict between them.
And of course, Trish, you're dealing with cases at the sharp end, as you say, cases which have rumbled on, have cost money, cost emotion, sometimes actually cost the health, the well-being of the children and indeed the parents concerned. But I want to ask both of you from the off, aren't all separations by definition conflictual, Trish?
Well, conflict is a normal part of all relationships. Conflict isn't necessarily a bad thing. I think the lack of a working model on how to resolve conflict is sometimes the issue. So, for example, parents themselves had their own parenting. If they've never seen their parents be able to resolve conflict, they can be very much at a loss about how to do that themselves. Or there may be other reasons about why the conflict can't be resolved. You may have a parent who has various kinds of personality disorder as a result of their own childhood and upbringing. And I think compassion really, and empathy and understanding of that is the key to unlocking, what currency do they place on their child's heart? We talk about the expense of legal proceedings, but what is the cost of a child's heart? And very often the children will say that they don't want to be disloyal to one parent or the other parent. And they will often say, I find myself saying things to convince my dad I love him. And then I feel guilty that I've said that to my dad because when I go back, I say the same thing to my mum. There'll be children who'll be caught into the middle of this who feel it's their parents' war. It's not their war. They didn't ask to have the parents they've got, but they're 50% of each parent. And so if the parents are hurting each other in conflict, they're hurting the part of the child that's a part of the parent. I think that there are other issues that come to play. There's also the notion of winning and losing. I hear parents say this all the time. You're out to win and I'm always losing. And I remind them that what we are actually talking about here is a dysfunctional family system, a dynamic that the children have internalized as the working model of that family unit. And that parental responsibility means that they have to, unless there are justifiable reasons, so I want to add that, or there are child protection concerns or safeguarding concerns, they do have to be investigated. But it is very important that they come to appreciate that, they can substitute the courtroom for the therapy room. They can come with a different intention, that at the end of the day, they may be divorcing. At the end of the day, they may not have got on, they're separated, but they're not divorcing their child. And their child isn't divorcing the parents. And the child is powerless. And the child can very often have its voice lost. The voice is lost of the child, who really doesn't know how to please one parent or the other parent well enough, and may feel the burden of emotional distress as a result of that, anxiety, headaches, etc.
I'm interested in you referring here to the family system, and Joe, I'll come to you in a moment for the role of professionals, legal professionals in this. You mentioned the family system. It's what you family therapists call the family system. And for a relationship to reach the point of breakdown, of divorce and separation, that system by definition must be pretty broken, must be pretty dysfunctional. Does that not then make it really hard / nearly impossible to find resolution without conflict if that system by definition is so broken?
I mean, I think that's a very good question. I think that all human beings, myself included, all human beings are going to be trying to work out sometimes unconscious conflicts that they're not aware of, that then arise in their relationships. So if we look at children of high conflict divorce, very often I'll be seeing parents who were subjected to conditions where high conflict divorce or passive aggressive, no resolution of conflict, was their internalized experience of their parenting. And to be fair, most parents are genuinely trying to do the best that they can, but they sometimes get signposted, in my humble opinion, to maybe not the most helpful sources of support at a time when they really need them. So one of the aspects of helping parents to understand that actually what they may be projecting onto the ex-spousal relationship is much more to do with their own unresolved conflicts from their own past that they have been unaware of, because they haven't been able to understand how that has been a driver in the conflict.
Without becoming too cliche or psychological, what you're suggesting, if I understand correctly, Trish, is that we kind of dump our own stuff, we transfer our own stuff onto that ex-partner. So there will be conflict, but it's actually our own internal feelings, our own internal past, our own perhaps internal childhood that is really coming out to play. And at a time of divorce and separation, it's quite hard to have that level of self-awareness, isn't it?
Very, very difficult, yes, because you also negotiating the end of a relationship, the end of a marriage maybe, the end of a partnership, the end of the notion and idea that you're going to have a future as a family. And that involves a process of grief and loss. And of course, grief and loss involves a process of feeling guilty, of feeling angry, of feeling upset, of feeling down, of feeling it's unjust and it's unfair. And so, without negotiating that process, suddenly the first port of call is a solicitor's office. And to me, there's a missing link. I'm not saying that everybody should go for an alternative form of resolution, of conflict resolution. Because it may be that it's not suitable for everybody. If I can mention an example, I asked a gentleman to take me to the Jerusalem Family Court because they have set up a different system. And that system is that when parents are separating, they are invited to be assessed by a guardian or a social worker, and also by a psychotherapist or a psychologist, with a view to an independent report being written, which is produced to the judge to determine if they have got the capacity to enter into a therapeutic process to try and find a different way to resolve the conflict, placing the children at the heart of the process. Now, obviously, again, if there are justifiable grounds for rejection, if there are safeguarding concerns, they have to be investigated. What the judge will do then is weigh that up it's independent of the people we're assessing, and we'll make a decision that the parents may have to enter into that process. If there are no safeguarding concerns, the judge orders contact straight away. It's not waiting he or she is not waiting to find out whose fault it is or who's to blame.
And Joanna, if I can come to you at this point, because ultimately you're dealing with the system you're dealing with here in the UK. We're not close to adopting other models. Trish mentions a model there in Israel. And Trish also said that sometimes parents at that moment of intense conflict and intense pain get signposted to the wrong people or the wrong person. And some people would say that the involvement of professionals like yourself, you are a lawyer, can actually fuel the conflict. So your challenge is, how do you sort of straddle that line between being the advocate for your clients and not fueling conflict? We've all heard stories of breakups where there's a lawyer who is, I'm trying to think of the word, voracious, perhaps overly aggressive, overly accusatory. How do you straddle that line?
It's a really good question, but I just want to come back to something that Trish said, which ties in with the fact that the approach we have is very child-centric, as it should be. But the Israeli approach and also the Canadian approach, as well as I understand it, is much more holistic. And if we were to have a more holistic approach, then I think that there'll be much less antagonism at my end, and where I'm having to deal with that sort of thing. And it's a key point that we don't have. We will look at the child and the wishes of the child, but the parents are told to basically get on and talk to each other when there could be fundamental reasons why they're unable to do so. And those aren't addressed. So that's the first point I want to pick up on. The second one about antagonism, we don't need to have aggression when you're being firm. It is a mistake made by perhaps younger and inexperienced lawyers who think that's the way forward. But as I've mentioned in other podcasts, actually you often get a lot further just by being decent, breaking down barriers, inviting your other side to call you by your first name and try to get along a lot better. It isn't because you're going to be all chummy afterwards, but somebody needs to maintain a level of control without emotion.
For you, Trish, and I appreciate it's hard to respond to this briefly, but relatively briefly, what does divorce look like for children? Because it's very hard as adults and parents to internalize that, to understand how it feels for the child. But you're a child, your parents suddenly say to you, that's it, we're divorcing. How does that look and feel to them?
Well, children are very upset at the loss of the family unit. They will often tell me that they feel really sad, but they don't share that with their parents. Or they will say, if my mum and dad love me as much as they say they love me, why would they do this? Why would they not stay together for me? They will also harbour fantasies years afterwards of their parents getting back together because no one has helped them to understand some of their own processes in relation to it not being possible.
And Trish, do you find that the children sometimes blame themselves? I've certainly had that in my cases.
Yeah, I would agree with you, Joanna, there. Sometimes children will say maybe it's because I was misbehaving, or I didn't behave well enough, or I upset one of my parents, that I'm the reason, because children do it's not irrational, it's an emotional intelligence way of thinking. A child will think, if my mum's unhappy or my dad's unhappy, it must be my fault, even though that doesn't make logical sense.
Just to follow on, Trish, from that thought as well, if children are blaming themselves for the breakup, by definition, if they're seeing, for example, one of the parents be very critical of the other parent or very aggressive towards the other parent, are they in effect feeling that parent is being aggressive to them, being critical of themselves, because they're seeing that parent be aggressive to someone they love. And by definition, when they see that, they must then internalize that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I would agree with you. The child will often feel, if the parent is projecting a lot of conflict and hates the other parent, sometimes they will say, I think my dad hates my mum, or my mum hates my dad. They will start to feel that part of themselves that's a part of their mum or a part of their dad isn't lovable. And they can sustain for long periods of time an incompatible and contradictory belief system that is being placed inside them by their observations of the way their parents behave or don't behave. And that will have them at war with themselves and will create anxiety, they can somatize their distress by acting out, or by acting out and being oppositional.
Can you explain those two terms there? So somatizing and acting out. What does that mean?
So somatization would be the child has nightmares, the child has stomach aches, the child has headaches, the child becomes more clingy to the parent, the child develops some sort of need to be sure that the parent is around when they're not there. The child will say to me sometimes when they're in school, they can't concentrate because they're worrying about the parent who's at home or the other parent they haven't seen. Oppositional defiant behaviour is when a child does the opposite. They might act out their distress by trashing their room, by being verbally abusive towards another sibling or someone in school, or towards the parent themselves. And I always say to parents, every single thing that your child is communicating is a form of communication about their distress. And we do have children who do suffer from parental relationship distress because they're witnessing this all the time and there isn't anywhere for them to go.
Joanna, we've spoken a lot in the first two episodes of this series around communication. And I would imagine that part of your role in those very early stages when a parent comes to you is to ensure that they communicate correctly around the separation, the divorce to their children, because that can significantly impact on the outcomes for that child. So what do you advise people when they come to you? What do you advise someone listening to this now who's perhaps right at that point of communicating to their child?
Before you go any further, you need to take a step back and think about what it is that you feel is best in this situation and how to achieve it calmly. And as I said before, try and put yourself in the shoes of the other parent. Whatever your feelings are about that other parent, why are they responding as they are? Because if you bring an application to court, the court looks at two things: why you're bringing the application and why the other person is responding as they are. And sometimes it seems a very blindingly obvious point, but people actually lose sight of that. And somebody might bring an application because the ex-partner is remarrying and they don't want to be replaced and having a new daddy or a new mummy. And it can be that straightforward. And so sometimes one needs to look at what the issues are and how you can best achieve them, which seems like a simplified response, but it's actually a common sense one.
And if you take that a few steps further back, sort of right to the beginning of the breakup, the beginning of the separation, how do you advise your clients to communicate that to their children? Because that's going to be key, isn't it?
Communicating that whatever happens, that we're here, we love you, and we X, Y, and Z. And it should never be about I've had things about my rights are. You really have to park those right outside the door and recenter what your focus is.
Trish, is it a cliche to say that you're basically saying to your children, we are divorcing, but we are not divorcing you?
Yes. And I just want to follow up on what Joanna has said as well, is that I agree with everything that you've said, Joanna. And I think there's another issue, though, in the legal arena that I hear about, is that sometimes lawyers and solicitors will go back years and years into the old spousal relationship in the middle of a piece of work I might have been doing for some considerable period of time, because one parent decides they don't really want to be a co-parent with the other co-parent. And it is very, very difficult when some of the lawyers are probably trying to be advocates for their clients. So there's a missing conversation around, if the parents are in a process that they buy into and they're working to develop a co-parenting alliance together, which is placing the children centre stage and not their rights and not their needs and not what they want, then that has to be preferable, that, solicitors and lawyers can work hand in glove with services that can be supportive. And there's some very, very good services out there and people who can help in a different way.
Well, I just add on the back of that I have turned work away, which would be horrendous for my boss listening to this, but I have said, before you involve me, because I could be a red rag to a bull, how about you write them an email such as this? And there have been quite a few beautiful works of art that I have seen, which have been my work, but have come from the client to the other party saying along the lines of, look, what has gone on in the past? Let's leave it there. We've got to co-parent. I want to co-parent. What works? How do we go forward together? And often it's a completely different approach and one which may be effectual. So it's not always a great idea to have a solicitor bulldozing in. You have to pick your moments.
In some ways, I'd like this episode to be quite salutary and really get parents thinking. So I put this to you in the first instance, Trish. Listen, when you divorce, when you separate, emotions run high. It can be very tough for the parents, as we've discussed in the first two episodes, Joe, loss and change and anger and guilt. And we can talk about the 5 stages of bereavement, all sorts of things we could add in here. But fundamentally, it can be very hard to do things, I'm going to put in large inverted commas, well at that point. I want this to be salutary though, Trish, insofar as if you're listening to this right now and you are at the early stages of that process, how bad can it get for the children? So if the parents cannot function in a co-parenting, non-conflictual, non-hostile way, how bad can it get? Because I think it's quite important that parents are aware of that so that the majority can make that informed decision to do it differently.
It does get very bad for the children. And I think in some senses they eventually adopt a defense mechanism of cutting off from one parent because they can't keep alive an affection and an attachment to each parent. It just becomes too much for them. And while they might not say anything about it, a lot of children will repress in a box all of these distresses. And they won't share it with anyone. They don't share it at school because that's a safe space, maybe. If they don't have friends whose parents are divorced, they don't have anyone to talk to. They can often feel very isolated. They're also very loyal to their own family. And, you know, they can just sever the relationship in the end because it's not possible for them to resolve what is essentially their parents' war.
And one thing, Trish, is I'm not sure there's been enough research so far on the long-term effects on these children, on their ability to form stable relationships in the future when they have gone through something like this, because there is emotional harm, and whether intentional or not, these children are suffering. And I'm wondering what your views are on that. On the long term, we don't always look at that.
I think that's right. I think there's always need for more research. But a lot of the parents that I will work with would have been those children. And they're now parents trying to do the best they can, and they're disadvantaged. And they've never had the opportunity to address it till they're in that situation. And, you know, when a mum and dad have their child and they sit over the cot and they look into their child's face, there isn't just 2 parents in the room, there's 6 parents in the room. There's the echo of your mum and dad on each of your shoulder and the parenting influences that they have put inside that parent. And all parents of all generations will say, I'm never going to do it like my mum or dad did it because I'm going to do it better. And that's absolutely genuinely what every parent in the world wants to do. And then, hey ho, one day they find themselves repeating exactly the thing that they said they weren't going to do.
From what you're saying there, Trish, it leads me on to another thought that perhaps could help parents in this situation. Do you say to those parents, ultimately, what you do now is modelling to your children, and what they see you do is what they will do themselves? So do you want your son, your daughter, coming home to you when they're 20, 25 in a similar situation, in that same kind of conflictual relationship? Is that a fair way to look at this?
Well, generally, I will ask them a series of questions so that they buy into the process. I don't give advice. I don't tell them what to do. I can mirror back a child's distress and say, do you realise when you speak to each other like that, I'm now an embodiment of your child and this is how I feel. I think what I do say is, what do you want your child to say on the day they get married about your divorce? Do you think you will both be invited to your child's graduation? Have you thought about, because I'll be older than these parents and I'm a grandparent, have you thought about the long-term repercussions that could potentially be intergenerational? Will you have a relationship with your first grandchild? or any of your grandchildren. And so I use a longer term lens to look way ahead into the future, to really focus thinking and feeling on, actually, we need to get hold of this. We need to change something.
Joanna, what do you do in those rare circumstances where even someone talking as rationally and beautifully and articulately as Trish there, showing you the long-term lens, showing you what could happen, where perhaps you've got children who are suffering, acting out, perhaps encountering mental health issues themselves? What do you do in those instances where even that doesn't ensure that the parents, what was it the phrase you used last time, fly straight and turn right? What was it you said?
Straighten up and fly right.
Straight right. So even in those instances, the parents, either both of them or one of them, cannot straighten up and fly right. Even with all of this knowledge, what do you do then as a professional?
So you used the word rational, and that's exactly it. Is if somebody is not rationally thinking, then you are not going to be able to progress. And somebody has to have insight into their conduct in order to make changes. And if they haven't, it's not going to happen. And if you don't get anywhere in a conciliatory manner and outside of the court service, then there may be no other option open other than to issue. But when you're issuing proceedings, one may have in mind the fact that you're asking the court to do something very specific, such as if there has been estrangement, whether the court would authorise a reunification plan. Would it do that? But then do you have the funds to do that? And would the court approve a reunification plan? So there are ways of thinking around it rather than simply saying, well, this child doesn't want to see the father needs to listen to the child, the parents need to communicate. That's still not the answer to, there's no mechanism to get it started again. And so what we need to look at is where we've got a position whereby someone isn't thinking rationally, and they've got a court order and they're defying court orders, the child won't come, I can't make them come, then sometimes the sword of Damocles is to mention a consideration of a change of residence. And sometimes at that point, the penny drops. And that has happened in a few of my cases.
How often does it happen that you actually get to the point of a change of residence?
So it's not common, but it's not unheard of. It is a last resort. But that is not to say it doesn't happen, and the resident parent will be given every opportunity to ensure that the child has a relationship with both parents. If that parent continues to refuse, continues to act in accordance with recommendations, takes advice, and so on and so forth, then the court needs to look at, well, is it still in that child's best interest to change residence? Because if there are siblings, one has to remember the sibling relationship is longer than any other relationship. And if there are younger siblings in that house or older siblings, then that's going to be a major factor in moving them. There are lots of things to consider.
Trish, for anyone listening to this podcast now, and I'm pretty sure that many people would have come here exactly because they're struggling with conflict or hostility within their post-breakup relationship. That's why you're listening to us right now. Are there words of reassurance that we can give? So say, for example, you've got a situation where someone is in a situation with their ex-partner and they cannot find a way through. Is it fair to say that you can't always solve everything, and that actually the approach to take is one of trying to effect small changes, small shifts, and that if you tot up those small changes and those small shifts, you may actually effect big change?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. One of the things I say as part of the program is the ethos and the approach is we will focus on the present, not on the past. We'll focus on the problem that you think you've got, not the other parent. We'll focus on how to make a proposal to the other co-parent, as I call them, and help the parents to change the language. So instead of being accusatory or assuming, invite the other co-parent to explain something to them. So a good example is when the child moves from one household to the other. The child goes back, they feel a bit guilty because they had a great time. They say something they didn't mean to say. The parent takes it up as something to do with the child being upset during that visit. And I always invite the parents to just change your language, soften your tone, use different words, and think about if you were being asked a question and invited to respond, give the other parent time to respond. And And that's a new technique with some of the families I work with. Now, I do agree that it's all about a 50-50 win-win. It's not about win or lose. And what I say is, when there is a 50-50 win-win decision made, that is them on their way towards forming a co-parenting alliance. And that it's about effective, healthy co-parenting communication. And they can build on that. And they can be proud of themselves that they're doing this work, because it's not for the faint-hearted. It's not easy to come in and say to the other parent that you might have been in a court arena something positive about their parenting, and vice versa.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I admire both of you insofar as you must just often sit in front of people and want to bang their heads together. You must look at couples who are separating or divorcing, and you must just want to say, please, just sort this out.
Yeah, I've done it. I've said, why are you spending your money on me? You two need to go and talk and fight. Obviously, again, there's always the caveat with everything I'm saying, where there are no safeguarding issues, abuse, or anything like that. But we're talking about the generic squabble about these sorts of things. Yes, go and learn how to talk to each other. And I went to a lecture many years ago, and this chap said something which was very, very pertinent, very, very, it was amazing. He said, the two of you made children together. You must have had affection for each other at one point. Remember that child was born as a result of that. And remember that child, the other person is the parent, or the father of that child, the mother of that child. That's your child, but always they will be in your life, and respect them for it. And I thought that was just absolutely brilliant.
And it's part of this, Trish, as well, about reframing the way we think about our ex-partners. So, for example, should we think about everybody starting from a position of trying to do well, starting from a position of trying to be good enough, starting from a position of bringing all of their life history and experience and trauma, and that everyone is, in most cases, trying to do their best in very difficult circumstances. Is that a good starting point to diminish and reduce the potential for conflict?
Yes. And I encourage each co-parent to say something positive about the parenting of that parent. Now, that's sometimes very hard, and it changes the dynamic straight away. It changes the dynamic from blaming to a more empathic place, where if you are able to see a positive attribute in that parent, you're giving the child emotional permission, if you like, to also see and get hold of and take hold of that positive attribute.
And Joanna, you're smiling because sorry, forgive me, Trish, I just say, Joanna's smiling because you used the term emotional permission in a recent podcast. I think it was episode 2. This is key, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. As I was saying, children often take their cues from their parents, whether they are very deliberate or subtle. And the emotional permission is absolutely fundamental in allowing a child's relationship with the other parent.
I must just ask as well, both of you, you've got separations which are extraordinarily painful. They may have happened for painful reasons. It may not just be a case, in inverted commas, just a case of we've reached the end of the line, it's time. And those kind of separations happen, and they're pretty, they can be fairly well managed. Mum and dad, we've realised that but where you've got a situation where, for example, one of the parents has had a long-standing affair, for example, and you've then got all of the extra pain of the reasons for the breakup, that must make it really hard for that breakup and that divorce not to be conflictual. Being as human as we are, that must make it tough.
It is, and especially we get cases where I've got one at the moment where I've actually said to the parent, keep the partner in the background just for now. We're not saying a child should go in and dictate who should be there and who shouldn't. But when you're in the process of re-establishing contact, just let that child have some time with you. That is not to say that your partner will always be shoved in the background, not at all. But for now, it's important to listen to the child.
Trish, I wonder whether this is a bit of a Machiavellian question, but is there not a case for sorting this all out before you break up? I mean, if you're in a strong marriage, everything's sort of functioning fairly well, should you not think about sitting down with your co-parent and saying, look, in the unlikely event I do have an affair, or in the unlikely event, you're rolling your eyes at me, Joanna, but is there a case for sorting this all out before you find yourself in crisis?
Well, yes, but there's also a case for appreciating that most of us learn very hard by learning from experience. And that if we can't resolve it with the partner, it becomes their fault. when in effect, we should be doing our own work on ourselves. Because I think there's separate work as parents to do separately. And then I think in the co-parenting dyad, there's separate work. And I think in the parent-child dyad, there's separate work. And some of the children will have a closer bond with one parent or the other, be more like that parent. But I would like to go back to the point that Joanna made. One of the things that I say to co-parents is, what unites you is far more powerful than what disunites you. What unites you is your love of your child. And that's the reason they keep coming back.
I want to finish with this from both of you. In a sentence each, what reassurance can we offer parents who are going through this? What positive note can we end this on? You've explained how bad it can get. You've explained the impact that it has on children. You've explained the importance of keeping the children front and centre in all the decisions you make and all the decisions you take. What can we say to parents positively, parents who are in a high conflict situation, that going forward, perhaps we can reassure them that it will be okay? Trish, in a nutshell, what would you say?
Well, in a nutshell, I would use the children as my educators in this and say that the children will often come in and say, what you're doing is working, Trish. And I never thought that they would be able to talk to each other. And I feel much happier. And I feel also sad. And they will cry and they will say, why didn't they do this a long time ago? And that's genuine from the mouth of the children.
And also picking up on something that you said in a previous episode around looking after yourself. And Trish has talked about this today in terms of the different work to be done as parents and the work to be done as individuals and former members of a couple. This is not just a case of being focused and lasered in on your ex-partner. You have work to do on yourself. You have work to do for and with your children. This is a big piece of work overall, isn't it, Jo?
And for many people, it's the first time they've ever had to consider it. It's a big change.
And hopefully the last. I don't know anyone who would recommend going through more than one divorce. Trish, it really, really is both interesting and empowering to hear you talk, because the work you do is so important for the children that come to you, the children in crisis. And I hope that the essence of this episode has been to really emphasize the importance of getting it right, because if you don't get it right, the impact on the children can be really, really significant.
Yes, thank you very much. And I think the children will be able to tell us this into the future when they become parents themselves, that the investment of emotional labour in this process has to be worthwhile for their children as adults and for them as grandparents later on in their life.
It's a really nice point to end on. Trish, if anybody wants to find you, what's the best way to do so?
Well, I've got a website which I'm updating, which I've been trying to update for a long time, but I will be updating it. So it's Trish Barry-Relph. So that's TrishBarry-Relph.com. And it'll just come up as Co-Parenting Matters.
And having done it myself, Trish, I could say just do a search for Trish Barry-Relph on the internet, and you'll find your Twitter and various other ways of finding you. And Joanna, this has been such an important episode, hasn't it? Because we do talk about divorce and separation. We do think that the involvement of professionals and lawyers like yourself can fuel hostility, can fuel conflict. And I think this has been a really important lesson in how wrong it can go, and how important it is for all the professionals involved to remain measured, to remain calm, for both the separating parents to remain measured and calm, because what's at stake is not just the here and now, it's not just the next 5 years. It actually could be the next 60, 70 years of your children's lives.
Yeah, it's crucial. Think very carefully about the approach that you take in litigating.
Trish, thank you for your time. We shall leave you to go and enjoy the seagulls who've been contributing at various points.
I'm sorry about that.
No. I don't know about you, Joanna, but I found it quite relaxing.
It's been a delight.
It's been a delight to have the seagulls. Don't forget, if you're listening to this in its audio form, this podcast is also available in video form on YouTube and on Spotify. Just do a search for the Splitting Headache podcast. However you're listening to us, be it Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Acast, do follow us or subscribe. Then you'll have details of the next episode when it pops up. More information on these podcasts available at velamuslaw.com. Lots still to cover in this series: mediation, finances, in reality, Joanna, we could do 50 episodes, couldn't we? We are barely scratching the surface. Trish, thank you for your time. Joanna, thank you for yours. We'll be back with episode 4, which will deal with finances. Nice to have you along, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.